Before doing your underpainting, you want to prepare your canvas as usual. So you want 3 coats of gesso along with wet sanding if you choose to do that step. To make your imprimatura, you're going to use yellow ochre and dilute that with Gamsol. We're using Gamsol instead of medium because we want this to dry relatively quickly. You can mix directly onto your palette. And I'm using a soft brush to combine. You're going to apply this mixture in back and forth motions. You can also do swirling motions similar to when you apply gesso, and then use a soft cloth or paper towel to spread that out further. You want a nice and thin layer, so if you find that your yellow ochre mixture is too thick, just add a little bit more of Gamsol and keep blending. You should be left with a very consistent, even surface. Once you've laid down your imprimatura, you want to go right in with your drawing. It's very important that you do this quickly. Work very, very light, and then you can build up those lines if they're difficult to see. I'm using a graphite pencil here, no darker than 2B. Work efficiently, accurately, and try very, very hard not to smudge. If you do mess up a measurement, no worries. You can just take a little bit of Gamsol, wipe the incorrect measurement away, apply a little bit more of that ground, and keep working. You can't use your eraser, however. It will not be effective on this surface. Technically, your second layer will be erasure. So once you finish applying the ground, you're going to add highlights through erasing. So you'll need, number one, a box of Q-tips. You can buy these from the dollar store, just regular old Q-tips. You can also get those precision Q-tips. That'll be really good for fine detail. So have those ready to go, and you want some Gamsol off to the side. I've just used the cap to a jar to contain my Gamsol so it doesn't get too messy on my palette. So Q-tips, Gamsol, and then a relatively clean rag. So you'll see here, just showing you how to dip that Q-tip. So one end should be saturated in Gamsol, and I leave the other end of the Q-tip dry. So one end is wet, one end is dry. The wet end will go in to take off that yellow ochre, and then the other end will act sort of like a blending stump to render that material out and soften any harsh edges. So you're going into your lightest parts first. So everything that is canvas tone, or going back to your gesso layer, that should be the brightest points of your painting. Don't go in and just make everything bright. This really should just be the lightest areas. So concentrate on those highlights, then use the opposite end of your Q-tip, the dry end, to blend those edges out. This can also help you achieve gradations, right? So you'll have mid to light tones also present in your painting. So you can apply a bit of that saturated Q-tip in one area, use the dry end to blend out to get a variety of values. And this is really similar to working on toned paper, right? So with, let's say, white chalk or charcoal, you're adding those highlights and then blending that material out to achieve a variety of values. It's the same concept here, except we're erasing to get the same effect. So these steps, putting down your imprimatura, measuring out your drawing, and pulling lights all have to happen within 2 days. It really shouldn't surpass 24 hours. The reason for that is that the ground will dry and eventually be impossible to pull light out of. So be really efficient here. I don't want you to rush necessarily throughout the process, but just know that the clock is ticking as soon as you put your imprimatura down. A lot of the objects in your still life are going to have reflections and be transparent. It's important to take notice of highlights and how they behave when they're seen through an object. So for example, here my stripes, the white stripes that I'm pulling light out of are a lot brighter outside of the bottle, and I try to be less aggressive with, let's say, scrubbing the yellow ochre off inside the bottle, because there is a value shift there. The white stripes inside the bottle are not nearly as bright as the ones outside of the bottle, so I try to be conscious of that when removing that yellow ochre. And this is all about pressure. So if you're scrubbing harder, more aggressively, it's going to pull more yellow ochre off. But if you are more gentle with not as much pressure, you'll get a lighter effect. You'll see here I'm using my rag to pull out the lights from these stripes. You can use that if the Q-tips just feel like they're taking a little bit too long for larger surface areas. I'll wrap the rag around my finger, dip that in Gamsol, and then use that to pull light out from the yellow ochre. So your end result should look something like this. All of your highlights pulled out, a good range of highlights as well, from super bright to mid to light tones. This is really important in establishing highlight, mid-tone, and then next we're going to add our mid to dark values with burnt sienna. So your third layer will be a grisaille, and you're going to do this by using burnt sienna. Burnt sienna is a really lovely paint. I've said this numerous times that it's my favorite oil paint to work with. because you can do so much with it. You can thin it out to create really light values. You can build it up thick to create dark values, and that's exactly why it's so wonderful for underpainting. So add burnt sienna to your palette. You're going to grab some medium. And I'm going to show you what brushes you can use here, so you can go ahead and use the brushes you have been using for this class, the ones that you sort of go to for rendering, but you can also use brushes that maybe aren't the best for soft blending, so natural hair bristles or just bristles that have dried out. They will be perfect for underpainting because it will sort of integrate the grisaille into your canvas really well and soften out those values. So you can use both, and you'll see I'll do a mixture of the two. So here I'm just showing you the variety of values that you can get by adding medium to burnt sienna. For the grisaille layer, you don't necessarily want a whole ton of medium. It should be mostly paint and then add your medium sparingly. So each layer will have more and more oil. So the first layer didn't have any, that yellow ochre layer just had Gamsol. This layer, the grisaille, will have a little bit more oil, and then our last layer will have the most oil in it. So you're going to go ahead and get started on your grisaille. Grisaille literally means rendered in gray, but it's come to mean a lot of things in painting. It mostly now just refers to a painting rendered in monochrome. So while a grisaille painting may be rendered to completion, for our case, we're going to be using this grisaille for our underpainting. And of course, ours is not in values of gray, but it's going to be in tones of brown. So I go to, the darkest areas first, concentrate the paint there, and then I'll blend that out with my brush. And this step behaves a lot like charcoal, right? Or just drawing in general, where you're using one material, in this case burnt sienna, to create a variety of values. I'm also using Q-tips to blend here, so they're just as useful in this step as they are removing highlights. So in areas that, let's say, I put maybe too much material down, I use Q-tips to sort of remove. You'll see here I'm also going back into those stripes where I've removed highlight. Sometimes if you feel like you were overbearing maybe with where you pulled highlights out, you can of course add darks back in the grisaille layer. Or if an area just needs additional shadows, you can of course add. Be really mindful in this stage. This is going to be your painting. You can do some editing in the glazing step, which comes after underpainting, but you really want to set yourself up for success here. So the more accurate your underpainting is, the more accurate your painting is overall. This is the foundation. This is very much the final product. So make sure that you're being mindful in how you're navigating lights and shadows, how accurate you are with what you're rendering. And of course, always work in areas. I say this all the time. Areas, not objects. This will give you the most accurate read and provide good comparisons for contrast. So you don't want to work object with an object. Super important for you to work alongside. So here in the stripes, I'm working stripe to stripe to make sure that I have a consistent and cohesive sense of light and shadow, especially if it's within folds. All the shadows should be falling in the same place, and all the highlights should be as well. Here I'm going back in and layering burnt sienna, and like I said, that's one of the most beautiful things about this paint is that you can build and build and build, create darker transitions if you need to, and of course, pull those transitions off if it gets to be too dark for what you need. So this step, the grisaille layer, third layer, you don't have to be as urgent in your process. So it's really steps 1 and 2, laying down the yellow ochre, measuring, and then pulling your lights out that are time sensitive. The grisaille isn't, so you can keep working on this as much as you want. You don't have to be as panicked about getting it done by a certain time. So you're going to keep working on your underpainting in these sections, and you'll slowly start to see those objects take form. You have to be really mindful of every object's inherent material, right? So the fabric should feel nice and soft. The bottle should feel reflective or look reflective. The wood should feel rough, right? Have some type of texture. So be really mindful of that when you're working. And don't get overwhelmed with this needs to look exactly like the object I see in the still life. That can really sort of limit you with how accurately you're describing that object. I think it's best to just paint what you see, right? Just be observant. You see a shadow somewhere, you see a highlight in another area, just paint that, right? Don't question it or override that observation with what you think it should look like. This really is, about observational painting. So you should just be painting what you see. When you're working within the bottle, be really mindful of what's through the bottle, right? So what do I see transparently and what is on top? What you'll get often is, of course, the values of the stripes in this case behind the bottle, but you can see I'm also trying to pull the highlights that are on the surface of that object too, that span maybe a couple of stripes or go down the entire bottle. And it's really important for your brain to kind of switch back and forth. Takes a little bit to get used to it. It's a little overwhelming at the beginning, but you'll be able to manage once you do it a couple of times. So I'm continuing to work here, working in sections. Whenever you feel overwhelmed or exhausted by one area, jump to another area and establish the values there. Again, this is going to be your painting, so make sure you're as accurate as possible. This step in the underpainting, I related a lot to drawing because, of course, you're working from one material, and you should really think about it that way. I think a lot of you probably feel more familiar with drawing or maybe have more confidence in drawing. So this could really be your way to understand painting a little bit better. And within painting too, contrast. With our first finals, I think a lot of what you all struggled with was maintaining saturation and a good structure of values. Balancing both is really difficult at once. So underpainting lets you isolate those two things where you can establish contrast, light and shadow, density within this layer. So this is where you can focus on that one aspect of painting. And then in our glazing layer, you can focus on color and saturation. So that's really helpful for a lot of artists. And I think, a really great way to work. So you can see here that I'm going into the shiny fabric, which has a more dense variety of values. So I'm packing on that burnt sienna a little bit thicker. I'm also using my cloth again, my rag, to blend things out, just like I did in that first layer. I'm sorry, that second layer when pulling lights out. Um, I also use my Q-tip to pull wrinkles or highlights out of, let's say, a darker area of burnt sienna. So you can very much use Q-tips here to continue removing paint if, let's say, you've gone too dark. It's really good for reflective light and little details in the fabric. So use whatever tool you need to get the effect that you want. And again, don't get overwhelmed by the fabric. If you're working in sections, it should feel more digestible and manageable. And I'm really just painting what I see in front of me, not trying to make anything up, not trying to cut corners. It really is about being observant. And the thing with this shiny fabric is that things that are reflective will jump in values quite quickly. So the highlights get very, very bright, and then once you get to the shadows, they're super, super dark. And when you put those things next to each other, they look reflective. So be mindful of that when you're working through this fabric. So our next and final step is your darks. And you're going to achieve your darks by using burnt umber. Same concept, you're going to apply your paint to your palette, have some medium close by, and again, like I said, this layer is going to be the most oil heavy. Each layer should have a bit more, and we're going over that fat over lean concept. Burnt umber should be used very sparingly, so it doesn't mean that you go back over every single shadow in burnt umber. It should only be used for the areas that are the most dense. We want to keep the warmth of the burnt sienna. While umber is still warm, it's on the cooler end and a little bit more desaturated than burnt sienna. So you risk completely neutralizing everything. If you add too much umber, it can get really muddy. So be very sparing with this. Only go into your darkest darks, and you can see how far the contrast is pushed once that burnt umber is applied. This layer you can do right after your third layer, so it doesn't have to be done separately. Some people like waiting for their grisaille to dry, so the burnt sienna layer, and then going on top with burnt umber, but that's completely up to you. You can work on it at the same time or wait in between. I prefer waiting a little bit in between, but it really doesn't make a difference. You can do them both at the same time. So for this particular still life, you can see that the burnt umber is really only being applied to that reflective fabric because its local value is a lot darker than the stripes. So I'm really just concentrating the burnt umber there to get those values darker. Burnt sienna can only get so dark, so burnt umber is here just to sort of help that along. You can see here I've left some of the painting unfinished, and this is just for the sake of the demo. Ideally, you would do the entire canvas at once, right? So full layer of yellow ochre, completely draw out your entire still life, pull all of your highlights out, completely finish your grisaille, and then go into umber. So the entire thing should be done. You shouldn't be doing areas of all 4 steps. It should be the entire painting. So here's a snippet of the end product, good range of values. And once this is completely dry, or at least dry to the touch, you'll be ready to move on to glazing.